Well, hello and welcome everyone to our virtual First Friday for April. We're so glad to have you here with us. My name is Jody Lewis. I'm the Director of Learning Services here at the Kentucky Historical Society, and I'm standing in for Carol Easterly, who couldn't be with us today. Before we get started, just a few reminders about Zoom. Please remember to keep your microphones on mute so that we don't have any noise distracting from the speaker, but also feel free to keep your camera turned on if you would like to. For the best experience today, we recommend choosing speaker view so you'll be able to clearly see any images or media that Dr. Moore may want to show us. I know you have a PowerPoint slide. You'll find the view options at the top right corner of your screen. It says view. You may use that chat function anytime during the program to communicate your questions and comments. You can access the chat by clicking on the conversation bubble icon, probably just in the middle at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the program, I'll communicate your questions to the speaker. We have more people coming in. Let me admit everyone. And finally, please remember to be courteous and respectful to all of the participants in today's discussion. I also want to make you aware that we will be recording this session and it will be live on our social media outlets after today. Also want you to be aware, as people are streaming in, want you to be aware of other things happening here at the Kentucky Historical Society. Please plan to join us next month for the first Friday in May when our topic will be Tradition Appalachian Music. We'll be learning about the life and work of Catherine Jackson French, Kentucky's forgotten ballad collector, and our speaker is Professor Elizabeth DiSavino of Berea College. You won't want to miss out. This project actually won a history award in November of 2020. It's hard to believe, but it is almost time for summer camp. The weather is getting finer despite yesterday's snow. The weather is getting finer, summer is around the corner, and KHS will be hosting our history-themed camps in person this year. Hurrah for that, with COVID safety protocols in place. If you're looking for summer activities for your children or your grandchildren, please visit our website to learn more about all the fun options we're going to be having this summer. And another promotion, if you have not already filled out your taxes, and you do have until July this year, please consider donating a portion of your refund to the local history trust fund. It's easy to do. Just look for line 38F on your state tax return, Form 740. If you check that box, you designate the amount you would like to contribute, and 100% of those funds are used to provide grants to local history organizations around the Commonwealth of Kentucky. They're doing really important work preserving and sharing local history in their communities, and KHS is very, very proud to administer that local history trust fund. All right, enough of the housekeeping. Let me start now by introducing today's speaker, Dr. Christopher Moore, who we are thrilled to have with us. Dr. Moore teaches courses in history and religion at Catawba's Valley Community College, and he's also an adjunct instructor at Mercer University. He's a graduate of Campbell University in North Carolina, where he received a BA in religion, as well as a Master of Divinity degree. Dr. Moore also holds a master's degree in theology from Duke University, as well as a PhD in religion from Baylor University. His research interests include religion during the American Civil War and Reconstruction, memory in the American South, church-state relations, and Baptist history. His work has been published in academic journals such as Southern Historian and Fides et Historia. His most recent work, which we'll be speaking about today, Apostle of the Lost Cause, is certainly relevant to our ongoing discussions about Confederate memory in Kentucky. And I'm looking forward to all of the insights we'll gain from his presentation today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for taking time out of your day to be here. Thank you to the Kentucky Historical Society, specifically to Carol for the invitation and to Jody for presiding over our time together. as we talk about something that I think captivates a lot of Americans, even Americans who just have a peripheral interest in history, the American Civil War. Something about that event captures us. And I came to this study the way a lot of people do, just growing up, hearing about the Civil War, being interested in it. But personally, along the way, I discovered something about myself. And that was that I was interested in what was happening in the American Civil War, what happened in the American Civil War, but that I was even more fascinated with what we told ourselves happened in the American Civil War. And that's very much the way I view history, as a story we're telling ourselves about the past. And so I don't think it's a stretch to say that after the cannons fell silent in 1865, what emerged in the post-war America was a battlefield of competing narratives. And we want to talk about one of those narratives today. Obviously, I want to talk about J. William Jones. I mean, he's the guy I wrote the book on. So he's going to feature prominently in our discussion. But I want to begin by wading into this idea of there being this battlefield of competing narratives, and how the lost cause mythology, which we always often refer to that kind of pro-Confederate white Southern memory lost cause. And you may know all the stuff I'm about to tell you, but I'm going to do the introduction anyway, as if you don't. And so I want us to begin by doing a little bit of introductory stuff here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, all my classes this semester are virtual. So I told Jody, if anything goes wrong, this is my own fault. I've been teaching all my classes online, so I should know how to do this. All right, a little bit about memory in the post-war America. Scholars like to identify various strains of memory. Historians who do, David Blight, you probably have heard that name before. Gary Gallagher, I'm actually borrowing some of his categories here to talk about post-war memory. But when we talk about post-war memory, we're talking about the way Americans answered some fundamental questions about the Civil War. Namely, what was the war about? Why did Americans fight in this war? And where do we go from here? Now, one of these memories, some of these are going to be pretty obvious. One strain of memory was called the Union strain of memory. And the Union strain of memory is based on the idea that the war was fundamentally about preservation of the Union. Now, certainly you can read the writings, letters, speeches of Abraham Lincoln. That seems to be a prominent feature. You read the diaries of Northern soldiers, prominent feature, preservation of the Union being a central part of what the Civil War was about. You also had people who said that the war was fundamentally about emancipation. Even before the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1, 1863, the war was about the emancipation of 4 million enslaved persons in the 1860s. Now, folks like Frederick Douglass are going to say, again, before white Northerners even knew that that's what this war was going to be about, that was always what the war was about. A third strain of memory was called reconciliation, or reconciliationism. Now, on the surface, this looks like this would be a good thing, right? You reconcile, you come together after the war, you put the war behind you. But there is a very kind of dark side to this reconciliationist narrative, because it was based on the idea that Southern soldiers and Northern soldiers both shared in quintessentially American virtues. In other words, this is a focus on the bravery and intrepidness of the common soldier. White Northerners could recognize that in white Southerners. White Southerners could recognize that in white Northerners. And the other side of that narrative, however, was to push the idea of race and slavery to the periphery. So then the war became only about people fighting for, different ideas, but ultimately espousing those same American virtues of bravery, of fighting for what you believe in. And so that's where that reconciliationist narrative, which is still very active today, by the way, maybe a little bit more camouflaged than it was in the 19th century. And then finally, the narrative that we're going to look at today, the lost cause mythology. oftentimes, a pro-Confederate white Southern narrative that makes inroads in the North too, by the way. But that's where we're going to focus today. And this is where J. William Jones, former Confederate chaplain, Baptist minister, author, editor, that's where he's going to feature in so prominently in kind of developing this narrative and giving it the staying power that it still has today. Now, talking about the lost cause, I haven't given you a definition of the lost cause. I have a fancy definition, a fancy academic definition, and then I have a snarky definition. I'm going to give you both. All right. Here's my fancy definition. My fancy definition of the lost cause is that it was a sacralization of white Southern history that entailed a veneration of Confederate heroes and an apology for the Confederate cause, primarily in an attempt to preserve a distinctive Southern identity vis-a-vis Northerners. Okay, so that word sacralization, making sacred. I'm borrowing that term from historian Lloyd Hunter. Making white Southern history sacred, all right? Venerating Confederate heroes, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and then making an apology for the cause, not apologizing for the Confederate cause, but making an apology for it, mounting a defense of the Confederate cause in order to preserve that distinct white Southern identity. Now, okay, academic definition. Here's my snarky definition. This is how the South won the war. Now, of course, they didn't win the war, but you could argue that they won the history. And J. William Jones is a big part of that. Remember, we're not talking about battle movements here. We're not talking about, what is actually happening in the war. We're talking about the story we told ourselves about what happened in the war. And Jones is a big part of that story. There were three main tenets, and of course you're going to see historians give you different numbers here. I've kind of boiled it down to three main tenets of the lost cause. You can certainly argue that there were more. But three main tenets of the lost cause were, number one, that the South had been overwhelmed by numbers and resources, which may seem like an odd argument for white Southerners to be making. But they get this straight from Robert E. Lee, who writes in his farewell address to the Confederate Army that they had been overwhelmed by numbers and resources. Now, somehow white Southerners spin this to mean that somehow they were still better soldiers, however, that they were outnumbered. Maybe one Southern soldier could have taken out 2 or 3 Yankee soldiers, but still the numbers were just stacked against them, that this was the kind of war that they were just destined to lose, overwhelmed by numbers and resources. Number two, they said that they were more virtuous, that the Confederate leaders were more Christian. So you got your Robert E. Lee, saintly Robert E. Lee, and then you've got U.S. Grant over here. Like, he's a bad guy. He's a butcher. All right. You've got your Stonewall Jackson over here, and then you've got your William T. Sherman over here. So it's very much this, good versus evil. Confederates are going to make a big deal of Confederate revivals that happen in their camps. We'll talk more about those later as well. But that's part of that narrative they're going to tap into to say that they were more virtuous than their northern counterparts. And then lastly, and this is a biggie, lost causers are going to say that the war was not about the issue of slavery. That slavery just, it happened to be there. It was incidental to the war. Yes, there were enslaved persons in the South, but that wasn't why the South seceded. Even though the secession documents in the southern states said that was the reason, even though secession commissioners that traveled around to the different states to get the southern states to secede, they're saying it's about slavery, and not just about slavery, but about white supremacy. So it's beyond just the institution of slavery. It's about preserving white hegemony in the South. And so, if we're talking about the stories here, sometimes these are based on primary resources. Sometimes they're completely untethered to primary resources. But this is how the mythology starts to snowball by the mid-19th century into the late 19th century. And I would argue still in some iterations today. Which brings us to J. William Jones. Like I mentioned, J. William Jones, Baptist minister, former Confederate chaplain, and one of the primary promulgators of this lost cause mythology. And the case I'm going to try to make to you in the next couple of minutes is that we are still tapping in to much of J. William Jones' logic about how we remember the past, whether we know it or not, whether you've ever heard of him or not. I'm going to argue that he's still very influential in the way that we talk about public memory. A little bit of background on J. William Jones. He was born in 1836 in Virginia, Louisa County, Virginia. Was converted at a Baptist revival meeting in 1855. Envisioned being a pastor and eventually a missionary, but he enrolls for 4 years at the University of Virginia before going to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. This is when it was still in Greenville, South Carolina. In 1860, he was an ordained Baptist minister. In 1860, he also married his wife, Judith Page Helm. They would have 5 children who survived to adulthood, 5 sons, 4 of whom became Baptist ministers. And I keep throwing that in there, that little Baptist angle there, because I think that's an important thing to talk about when you're looking at someone like J. William Jones and how denominationalism influenced him, how religion in general influenced the way that he talked about American history. Now, like I said, Jones had missionary ambitions. He envisioned being a missionary to China, but you can see the year here, 1860. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Foreign Mission Board is getting very hesitant to start funding missionaries to leave the States. And by December of 1860, right when Jones is going to say that he has his trunks packed and ready to go to China, South Carolina is going to secede from the Union. And the trajectory of Jones' life is going to change dramatically. Now, what I would argue is that during the American Civil War, that Jones takes all this zeal, all this fervor for evangelism, and he redirects it. This is kind of his Damascus Road experience. He's going to redirect it all into the American Civil War and try to cultivate revivals there. He never gets to China. He never becomes a foreign missionary, but he sees the war as his new mission field. In 1861, he joined Company D of the 13th Virginia, the Louisa Blues. He and his brothers did. He had ambitions from early in the war of being a regimental chaplain, and he will be a regimental chaplain. Eventually, he transitions to something called Army Evangelist. And we could get into the weeds about the distinction between the two, but they're essentially doing the same thing. They just sometimes had a different relationship with their local churches, a different relationship with their denomination. But essentially, his work does not change. He functions as a chaplain for the entire war, which was kind of unusual. Most chaplains didn't serve or most Army evangelists, I should say, didn't serve on a permanent basis with the Army, but he does. So he always kind of sees himself as a regimental chaplain attached, to his regiment. In 1862, late 1862, there break out in Confederate, the Army of Northern Virginia, a number of Confederate revivals. And I know you probably know what revivals are, but these series of meetings of intense religious fervor. And most histories will talk about these coming around the early 1863. I think you can date them back late 1862. And this is going to be the lens through which Jones refracts his understanding of the virtue of Confederate armies. In other words, what he's going to claim here is that by these revivals breaking out, and he's going to think there's around 15,000 converts in the Army of Northern Virginia. He's going to say that he thinks he baptized over 400 of these converts. What's important for this is, for Jones, looking at this through a religious lens, he thinks this means God is blessing the Confederate soldiers, and by extension, the Confederate cause. That's what he thinks is happening here. Which is going to be important because he's going to have to ignore the fact that there were revivals going on in the Northern armies too. But this is going to be his lens here. Like I said, on a more personal level here, he does have brothers who are fighting with him as well. His brother, Ed, was wounded in the lungs during the Battle of Gaines' Mill in June 1862. This is during the Peninsula Campaign. And Ed is going to go home to convalesce, and there he dies when he was 19 years old. Jones, another one of Jones' brother, Penn, was 22 years old when he was wounded at Gettysburg, also convalesced at home, but also succumbed to his injuries. So you always want to remember the personal element here. We're talking about, facts, figures, and stories. But obviously, Jones is going to come to this discussion of the American Civil War, having lost two brothers in the war. And so, yeah, that's going to influence, how he thinks about the Confederacy, how he thinks about the war in general. In the post-war period, Jones is going to serve at various pastorates. He's going to serve as an agent for the Foreign Mission Board and the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's going to be a general superintendent of the Sunday School Board of Virginia and a staff writer for the Religious Herald, which was a Baptist newspaper in Virginia. Again, you hear me bringing up that Baptistness, and I'll explain a little bit later why I keep coming back to that. He also becomes an assistant corresponding secretary of the Home Mission Board, and so he is very much tied in to the Baptist denomination, while at the same time considering himself essentially a historian, a religious historian of the American Civil War. But from 1876 to 1887, he really starts putting his mark on white Southern memory through the editorship of the Southern Historical Society papers. Now, over an 11-year period, he is going to be the editor of these papers, and these papers are going to include any number of narratives and letters that ex-Confederates are going to send in to try and draw the contours of what Confederate history are going to be. And notice that Jones, even though he's not the one writing many of these letters or these articles, he's the ultimate arbiter of what gets in and what gets out. He is redacting Confederate history, or as I like to think about it, he's taking all the pieces and he's making a mosaic from it, because he's the one who's going to decide which story gets where, which voices get heard, which voices don't. And we'll come back to the way he does that a little bit later as well. Some people will argue that even though he writes all these books that I'm about to show you, that it is through his editorship that he shapes the lost cause, that he controls the shape of the lost cause. He does write a number of books here, prolific author, J. William Jones. He really got his start in 1874. He had been a chaplain, obviously, in the American Civil War, but not many people knew his name. Even though he had met Robert E. Lee in the war, I don't know if Robert E. Lee really remembered him very much until Jones, after the war, kind of sidles up to Robert E. Lee. He follows him to Lexington. He gets a pastorate in Lexington while Lee is serving as president of then Washington College, now Washington and Lee University. And Jones really cultivates this friendship with Robert E. Lee. So much so that once Lee dies, the colleagues at Washington College, which again becomes Washington Lee University, they try to do this memorial volume for Robert E. Lee, but the project falls through. That's when Jones steps up and says, listen, if you give me the manuscript you have so far, if you give me access to Lee's papers, I'll turn out this memorial volume on Robert E. Lee. I knew him better than most of you anyway. Now that's going to be his MO. I knew these Confederate heroes better than anyone. I can give you insight to their religious lives in a way that no one else can. And so in 1874, he publishes personal reminiscences, anecdotes, and letters of General Robert E. Lee. And this is going to put him on the map. This is going to make Jones really a standard setter for future biographers of Robert E. Lee. He continues. 1880, writes a book on the Army, or edits a book on the Army of Northern Virginia. Then his 1887, Christ in the Camp, perhaps his most well-known book. This is where he's going to narrate those Confederate revivals. And here we really start to see how he's refracting Confederate memory through a religious lens. Then in 1896, he's going to write a school history of the United States. Now, this was very important for Jones, that the Yankees not write the history of the war. We often hear that the victors tell the story, the victors write the history. Jones knew that too. And so he was intent that this not happen. He writes his own history of the United States and gives disproportionate amount of attention to the Civil War. I think the first year of the Civil War has as much space as the entire American Revolution. It is clearly bent toward lionizing Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson. And even reviewers of his own day recognize that. Even fellow Southerners read this book and thought, wow, this is pretty partisan. And that infuriated Jones, that fellow Southerners. He expected Northerners to do that. It infuriated him that fellow Southerners thought that he had maybe pushed a little too hard here, let too many of his cards be shown here in 1896. 1889, by that time period, Jones has now sidled up to Jefferson Davis and now is making claims that he knows Jefferson Davis, Kentuckian, better than anyone else. And so then 1889, he gets permission from Davis's widow to publish this memorial volume. Finally, in 1906, since one biography of Robert E. Lee is not quite enough, he publishes another biography of Robert E. Lee, Life and Letters of Robert E. Lee, Soldier and Man. In his final years, he serves as chaplain at the University of Virginia and the University of North Carolina, secretary and superintendent of the Confederate Memorial Association, and finally, chaplain general of the United Confederate Veterans until dying on March 17th, 1909. Now, a little bit of the Kentucky connection here. Like I said, Jones attended Southern Baptist Theological Seminary while it was in South Carolina. However, he maintains a very close relationship with Southern Baptist Theological Seminary after it moves to Kentucky. In fact, he becomes an agent for the seminary in 1871. And when he does so, he begins to go out and obviously trying to raise money for the seminary. But while he's doing that, he's also moonlighting, doing these lectures on the lost cause. And what's interesting is you can read in his correspondence, which much of it you can find at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, by the way, to Dave. What's interesting is you can read in his letters how there's tension there. That is, seminaries writing him like, okay, we know that you're doing lectures about the seminary, but Robert E. Lee is showing up a lot in these lectures. And Jones is, he's kind of miffed at that. It sounds like he's, what? Of course I'm going to talk about Robert E. Lee. I'm raising money for the seminary. What does it matter? But in my mind, I don't think he saw any difference. I think that the virtues, as he saw them, of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis just meshed perfectly with his own sense of Baptist identity and Christianity. I don't think he drew that distinction. And I think that's one reason that he felt like he could do both those kind of lectures, advertising our cause, by that he means the Baptist cause, and the lost cause at the same time. Sends 3 of his sons to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary as well, and then begins to work for the Foreign Mission Board while it was in Kentucky. Now, this is what I think is very interesting. You might think it's interesting as well. When he's offered a position to work in Kentucky with the Foreign Mission Board, and this is how he responds in 1865. In a letter to the secretary of the Foreign Mission Board, he writes that he's not sure Kentuckians will receive him because of his too ultra Southern feelings. He thinks they're going to get him in trouble. Now, what's interesting about this is if you were at Dr. Ann Marshall's lecture on how Kentucky develops this pro-Confederate identity after the war, well, look at the date here. This is 1865. So Jones doesn't know that's going to happen. As far as he's concerned, that's still foreign territory to him. Like, the Kentuckians, they're not going to like me, because they're not going to take that same kind of pro-Confederate slant that I do. So I think that's really interesting. I don't know. Did Jones have a different view of Kentucky later in life? I don't know. But listening to Dr. Marshall's lecture, I thought that was really interesting here. Okay, so now, with the remaining time I want to have here, what I want to do is kind of make the case for why I think Jones is still important for us today. I didn't want to write a book on him just because he was a Confederate chaplain who didn't have a book on him yet. 3 main things I think that are important for looking at Jones and his influence. Number 1 is his denominational identity. This may seem like a kind of a nuanced take on things, but in lost cause scholarship, there has been a prevalent narrative that both in Confederate camp revivals and in the lost cause mythology, that there was ecumenism, which could mean pretty much anything. It could mean you're just cooperating with fellow denominations. It could mean that you're blending denominational distinctions to the point that you can't tell where one begins and one ends. So one thing I wanted to do in this book was to emphasize Jones' Baptist identity. And what I think you see in these Confederate revivals is not necessarily, there's two different ways of looking at it. You can say the Baptists and the Methodists and the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians are working together, therefore that's ecumenism. But you also see in these Confederate revivals a strong intention to maintain denominational identity. In other words, they even had a baptismal exchange program where, if a convert came to a Methodist chaplain and said, I'd like to be baptized as a Baptist, the Methodist chaplain was not going to be, well, sorry, we can't make that happen. I'm Methodist. No, he would refer that soldier to a Baptist chaplain. And then the, quid pro quo, the Baptist chaplains would refer people to Methodist chaplains. And so, in other words, you're saying, well, that's ecumenism, that's cooperation. Yes, but it's a cooperation that maintains denominational identity, that maintains denominational distinctions. You don't have chaplains saying, well, it doesn't matter how you want to be baptized. No, they still thought that mattered. And after the American Civil War, what you see in Jones' private correspondence is that he is so, I don't want to call him hyper Baptist. I think he was like pretty run of the mill, dyed in the wool Baptist, like a lot of Baptists in the 19th century. But you see, he's very much an advocate for the Baptist denomination. He is not interested in downplaying denominational distinctions. So that's one reason I think he's important if you're looking at Civil War historiography. But most people are not as concerned with historiography. We're more concerned with public memory. We're more concerned with Confederate monuments and Confederate flags. I mean, that's what we're talking about. That's what's in the news cycle. So, where does Jones fit in there? Well, the name of the book is Apostle of the Lost Cause. And I know it's kind of in vogue to use the name apostle just because it sounds like a clever name, but I really tried to take it seriously here. My background, I actually came to the study of history through the back door. My degrees are in religion, and I am a religious historian. And so when I'm talking to my students, if they start asking me about the calibers of bullets and things like that, I'm like, hold on, I'm not a military historian here. I look at the religious aspect of what's going on in the mid-19th century. And so when I call him the apostle of the lost cause, I mean that. I think if you look at the New Testament, you can see the roles of apostles as kind of being twofold. Now, I'm probably making my New Testament colleagues angry by defining apostleship this way, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think apostles had two functions in the New Testament. Number one, preserve a faithful narrative of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And number two, to testify to an incarnation of God in the person of Jesus. All right. So faithful narrative and incarnation. And I would argue that Jones does the same thing for the Confederacy, that he is interested or even obsessed with maintaining the faithful narrative, as if Robert E. Lee did ask him to write Christ in the Camp. So he sees that as a personal commission, almost as if from Jesus, to preserve the Confederate gospel. And that's how I would define Christ in the Camp. That's the Confederate gospel. This is what happened. This is how the story of God's favor on the Confederacy. And then incarnation. I imagine Jones and his ilk seeing, how does the Southern spirit survive without the Confederate body? There's no government anymore. So you kind of have this sense of disembodiment. And I think that Jones, for him, it was very important that the Southern spirit be embodied. It wasn't just about saying that Confederates in general were virtuous people. No, he had to focus on Robert E. Lee. He had to focus on Stonewall Jackson. Eventually, he has to focus on Jefferson Davis and say that Confederate virtue is incarnated in these individuals. And I think you could even, and I don't want to psychoanalyze too much here, I think you could probably see the same thing in the monuments as well. There's a tangibility there that I think white Southerners have been drawn to. I grew up in the South. I think there is this sense among white Southerners that what it means to be Southern means that you talk funny and you like fried foods. And I think those monuments probably at a psychological level. I know that I need to stay in my lane here. I understand that. But I think maybe at some psychological level, there is a tangibility there that appeals to many white Southerners. And then finally, finish up here by talking about how I think Jones influences the discursive framework of how we talk about public memory today. Three primary ways he does that. Number one, And again, I know you're probably making these connections already to the modern day conversations we're having about public memory. But one thing Jones does, as do other ex-Confederates, is he essentially treats Robert E. Lee as if he is the reincarnation of George Washington. Pictured here on the PowerPoint side, that is the Confederate seal. It has George Washington on there. The Civil War, in many ways, is an ideological struggle about what does it mean to be an American and who emerges from the Civil War as the truest Americans. And Jones is going to say that the South has adopted the mantle of George Washington, that George Washington was the first rebel, as he calls them, that George Washington had seceded from the British Empire, and that Robert E. Lee, that he's essentially George Washington for the mid-19th century. Now, he's going to leverage I told you before, sometimes this mythology is not tethered to primary sources at all. Sometimes it does tap into historical fact in order to make an argument. Jones is going to say that Robert E. Lee's father fought with George Washington. That's true. I mean, that is true, that his father, Henry Lee, fought with George Washington. It is true that Lee's wife, that her father has familial connections with George Washington's family, or Martha Washington's family at least. And so he's going to tap into that and really tie those two individuals together. Now, why that's important is this, because by doing so, Jones interweaves those mythologies to the point that you can't talk about George Washington without talking about Lee, and you can't talk about Lee without talking about George Washington. Now think about the last time someone was debating about Confederate monuments. What's almost immediately coming up by people who want Confederate monuments to, I'm painting with broad strokes here, but one of the common arguments you hear is, oh, what are we going to do with the monuments to Washington and Jefferson? They owned enslaved persons too. And then we get in the back and forth about erasing history and things like that. My point here is that Jones put in safeguards. That's exactly the conversation he would want us to be having in 2021, because we've lost the ability to distinguish one mythology from the other. Second, you talk about the story that Confederates are telling through the erection of monuments. I would argue that they tell just as much of a story by the monuments that never get erected, such as is the case with General James Longstreet, who I'm sure you've heard of before. After the war, now James Longstreet had an impeccable pedigree in terms of Civil War battles that he was in. He was Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, especially after the death of Stonewall Jackson in the spring of 1863. You've got Lee referring to Longstreet as his old war horse, or the staff in his right hand. So Lee and Longstreet, they were tight. But after the war, Longstreet commits two unpardonable sins. Number one, he aligns himself with the Republican Party. And so white Southerners, write him off as a scalawag. Number two, and even more serious, he has the audacity, the unmitigated gall to criticize Robert E. Lee. Not only does he criticize Robert E. Lee, but he criticizes specifically what Robert E. Lee did at Gettysburg. And Longstreet's going to say, listen, I told him that was not a good idea. And he did it anyway. Now, Jones, that's going to infuriate him in a way that nothing else does. Jones and his Jubal Early, I know you probably former General Jubal Early, both of those guys decide to character assassinate James Longstreet. That's not a theory. That's not a conspiracy theory. You can see that in their letters. Jones literally writes to Jubal Early, I am ready for you to slice up what is left of Longstreet. In other words, we're going to obliterate him from Southern memory. And they do. They print a series of articles in the Southern Historical Society papers that are meant to so destroy Longstreet's reputation that it can never be rehabilitated, to the point that some Southerners still have an affinity for James Longstreet, but by the end of his life, you've got some of these veteran associations that refuse to send condolences. You've got white Southerners printing in the paper that they wish he had been killed in battle, so he wouldn't have had the chance to, quote, betray his race. So all of these things go after James Longstreet. How does that tie into modern debates? Well, all you have to do is find his monuments, and good luck, because there's going to be a marker in South Carolina where he was born, statue in Georgia where he died. And in 1998, that's 1998, not 1898. That's when a lot of those other monuments are going up. In 1998, there finally is a monument at Gettysburg. And if you look at it, it's non-pedestaled. It looks diminutive. That's probably unintentional. But if you know the story about Longstreet, then you're like, well, it's kind of hard not to read something into them. And so I tell people, if you want to talk about erasing history, then let's talk about the monuments to Longstreet, if you can find them anywhere. And then finally, and I'll end here, Confederate symbols, namely the Confederate flag. What you see, or the Confederate battle flag, what you see in the Southern Historical Society papers, the articles that Jones prints, make a nuanced, albeit very awkward, distinction between the Confederate national flags and the Confederate battle flag. And you see this narrative start to unfold that the politics of the Confederacy, that's the national flag. But the common soldier is associated with the Confederate battle flag, that they represent two completely different things. And of course, this kind of taps into that reconciliationist narrative, that the battle flag, all Americans can be proud of the Confederate battle flag because it represents bravery, going up against unbelievable odds, you're fighting for what you believe in. And so you see that distinction being made. And you still hear that argument today. It's a very common argument that people make who like to display the Confederate flag, the battle flag, is to say that represents something different than the politics of secession, that represents something different than association with chattel slavery. That's also one of these safeguards that Jones puts in place, that narrative that unfolds in the post-war South. I'll end here with a quote from a German philosopher, Ernest Cassirer, who writes that in the relation between myth and history, myth proves to be the primary, history the secondary and derived factor. It is not by its history that the mythology of a nation is determined, but conversely, its history is determined by its mythology. And I don't know if we want to, get into get all into the philosophical implications here, but I do think there is something to be said with mythologies not always developing, post analysis of historical fact or post rational reconstruction of the past. I think it's often mythology that drives us to want to know more about one historical event or the other, because I think mythologies are these narratives that give us an interpretive framework to answer existential questions about who we are, where we came from, and why we're here. And that's why I think it's accurate to call the Lost Cause a mythology, because for white Southerners, it did answer, and I would argue it still is attempting to answer, to white Southerners, about white Southerners, who are we, how did we get here, and why are we still here? Why are we here? So, but anyway, so I think I probably exceeded my time here. And so I'm going to take off the screen share and close my mouth for a couple of seconds. Jody?
Not too long at all. That was absolutely fascinating. I encourage anyone who has a question to go ahead and, excuse me, put it in the chat box, and I will read those out. Again, that chat box there in the middle, sort of the bubble. Absolutely fascinating, boy. So resonates with what's happening in our country now, isn't it? I do have a couple of questions that I'd like to start off with. I was really interested to hear about how others, even in Jones' time, were aware of a little twisting of the narrative. And I wondered if there were any Union counterparts, any counterparts who were kind of pushing back against this at that time.
Yeah, that's a good question. And there absolutely were. And that's a part of the scholarship that and maybe I'm just not seeing it and it's out there, but I think that's a place where I would love to do more research. You definitely have Northerners that pick apart the Lost Cause narrative and say, whether it's treating Lee like he's in some completely different category as Grant, that they really are calling the Lost Cause, and specifically the Southern Historical Society, they're calling them out sometimes. Of course, folks like Frederick Douglass are obviously calling out the Lost Cause, but he's also going one step further and calling out that reconciliationist narrative too, saying that white Northerners, he suspects, and that's kind of his prophecy, which tragically comes true, is that white Northerners will disjoin themselves from African Americans and unite on the basis of shared whiteness in order to get the country back on track. that ultimately the African-American narrative will be pushed to the periphery. He was right about that. But yes, there are folks that go after Jones. But here's what Jones is going to do. He's going to take those narratives and put them in the Southern Historical Society papers, redact them. And I'm not saying just change words, but he's going to put them in such a way to kind of feed his the narrative that he's saying that the South's being persecuted. Look at them. They're coming after us. And so it was kind of this thing where I think he invited those kind of critiques because it still played into what he wanted to say, that see what they're trying to do. They're trying to attack the facts and make history what they want it to be. So, yeah.
It's so chilling. I remember years ago, I was working with students, and one of the students said to me, "This lost cause is it's like Hunger Games." You know, and I thought, ooh, interesting analogy, interesting thought there, twisting stories to
right.
We had a question in the chat box. What was Jones' full name? The tombstone showed William M. Jones.
Yeah, well, John William Jones. I don't know if the M was connected to the W to mean William. I may have to look back at that gravestone. That's a picture I took, so I really have no excuse if I don't know that. But yeah, John William, he comes to be known as J. William Jones, even though his friends called him John. So.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I'm having trouble accessing the chat box.
Okay.
My name's Carl Kramer. I wrote a review of Apostle of the Lost Cause that just appeared in the Journal of American History. So I have a long interest, not depth, but personal interest in this subject from a Presbyterian standpoint. My wife is the great-great-granddaughter of James Henley Thornwell, the Presbyterian divine, who wrote the document that split the Presbyterian Church. And I reviewed James Oscar Farmer's book, The Metaphysical Confederacy, for the Filson Club journal several years ago. And my wife's great-great-uncle, Clark Barry Stewart, was pastor of Fairview Presbyterian Church in all of a sudden in the Simpsonville, South Carolina area. And when the men in his church went off to the war, he went with them. And all this causes me to wonder, maybe how common was this that ministers actually went off and joined their troops or their congregants, and what kind of influence did that have overall? It certainly seems to be something, a topic that needs to be studied in much greater depth.
Sure. That's a wonderful question. And let me begin by saying, Dr. Kramer, I appreciated your review. You write a book, you always get a little bit nervous once those reviews start coming out. I do appreciate your review, and I'm glad to see you semi in person here. To your questions, yeah, you certainly did have ministers who would follow their, obviously you've got the congregation that still needs a minister. And so you always had that, factoring in, how many ministers could go to the army. And that's where you end up with these distinctions between a regimental chaplain like Jones, who would have joined the army and then applies to be a chaplain and then eventually is made chaplain, versus an army missionary who could be sent by a denominational board, and they would be serving with the army on a semi-permanent basis. So they weren't necessarily tied to the regiment. They're not, if they went away, they're not going to be like AWOL or something, or deserters or things like that. And then you had army evangelists who were often sent by local congregations to the army, and they were on a even less permanent basis. You could have army evangelists that would come. Jones would invite people, by the way, he would invite ministers he knew to leave their churches for a sabbatical or something, come preach in the army, and then you can go back to your church. And that was a grueling schedule, by the way. We have, there was something that chaplains began to describe called clergyman's sore throat. And it was just from a common ailment that these pastors would have. They're preaching multiple sermons a day. And so, yeah, they are coming from their congregations. There's another debate going on, and probably in the North, but I'm more specific with, well, I know what's going on in the North, but I'm more specific, more familiar with the Southern troops here, a debate about whether chaplains should be fighting in the war. And that was, Northerners had some regulations about their chaplains. The Confederacy had almost none, no ranking. They weren't really told what they were supposed to do. It was very willy-nilly. They didn't know if they were supposed to be fighting, if they should be wearing something that distinguished them. Many of the Northern chaplains were wearing black frock coats. Well, the Confederates didn't want to do that because that made them look like they were dressed in the Union uniform. And so there's a lot of debate as to whether chaplains should actually be taking up arms and fighting as well. And so, yeah, those are debates that are going on both North and South. But yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think you're right. I mean, the more research, I'd love to do more research in some of those conversations happening among the chaplain groups.
Thank you. And that was Fountain Inn, South Carolina, that he was from. My mind went blank for just a second.
We have a question here in the chat box from Dr. Chuck Welsko, who is on staff here as the head of the Civil War Governors of Kentucky project, and he has a great question or great thought. How can historical society or public history in general help to engage and challenge this whole lost cause narrative that just seems to be so deeply rooted right now? What might we be able to do?
That's a wonderful question, and I would love to just sidestep that and send that to my brother. My brother works with museums and historical society in North Carolina, so he and I have a lot of conversations about. And I joke with him that I can go into a classroom and I can shoot my mouth off about all sorts of things that I want to happen in the world, but he's boots on the ground. I'm actually the one putting this together for public consumption, and how do we have these conversations? And I know from, just talking with my brother, talking about what the lost cause is, talking about it as a, as a strain of memory that starts to, and then outline what that argument is. And maybe I should a little personal anecdote here. What got me interested in the lost cause many years ago was Charles Reagan Wilson's Baptized in Blood. And I know that book got a lot of people interested in the lost cause. But the first time I was reading that book, it was like someone had hit me in the chest with a brick. I thought, my gosh, he's talking about me. And I realized how much of those narratives growing up as a teenager and beyond that I had just adopted uncritically. And it wasn't until college before I started to take a step back a little bit. And there's only so many steps you can take back from in historical narrative. No one's coming to this completely objectively. But I saw that as a narrative in and of itself and how easily it had become part of my story, the way I thought about history. And so I think this is kind of like a non-answer, but I think trying to create that atmosphere where someone can connect the dots themselves. I'm a firm believer that we can't change each other's minds, but you can give people enough time and space to convince themselves that they changed their own mind. And I feel like that's what Baptized in Blood did for me, that it made me start to reevaluate things. And it wasn't overnight. It was a few years before I started to piece things together and say, that museum exhibit was talking about me. I didn't recognize it, but now I do. And so, again, maybe a non-answer, but when me and my brother figure it out, we'll let you know.
Fantastic. There's a terrific podcast I love called Uncivil that is directed about lost cause. Yeah. We have an interesting question too from Joetta Prost. She says, I've researched a Universalist minister from Boone County, Kentucky. And then for you, since you're outside of Kentucky, she clarifies that's a Northern Kentucky borderlands area. And she said this Unitarian minister grew up in a slave-holding family and was just a few years older than Jones. Reverend Absalom Graves Gaines also attended University of Virginia before being ordained and leaving Boone County to serve in congregations in New York, never returning to the South because of his opposition to slavery. And then she asks, have you, Dr. Moore, ever encountered information about Universalist ministers who are either pro-Union or pro-Confederate? So Unitarian Universalists or just Universalists? Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, no. That's a really good question, which I tell my students when you hear a professor say that, that's code for I don't know the answer. That's a really good question. I'll look it up later. And that is, I've done a little bit. I know that there was debate. I mean, we're talking about the South here, but I know there was debate in the North about Christian commissions and organizations, the Sanitary Commission. There were criticisms between those groups about, well, that commission's led by a universalist unitary, and they're, we don't want to be associated with that. And so that's the only thing I have. And that's not even talking about the Confederacy. That's talking about the Union. For Jones, he's really pretty silent about that. And I would go further than that. When he is cooperating with denominations in the Confederacy, he's talking primarily about Presbyterians and Methodists, Episcopalians maybe, and Baptists definitely. But one kind of argument I keep coming back to in the book is that I think he's anti-Catholic. I don't think he's more anti-Catholic than a lot of the other Southerners, white Southerners, were during that time. But I think it's you sometimes have to read between the lines because there are Roman Catholic chaplains, and he just seems, he knows that they're there, and there are some very well-known ones. But Jones just gives them really short shrift here. And so I imagine he would have done something similar with Unitarian Universalists, even though maybe for different reasons. But yeah, so I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that. No,
interesting. Last call for any other questions. Thank you for that, Ms. Prost. That was an interesting question for sure. Well, we're coming up on 1 o'clock, and I do want to be thoughtful of the time, both for our viewers, but especially for you, Dr. Moore. This was absolutely fascinating to me. And I think such, as I've said a couple of times now, such a timely thing to think through. Yeah, I agree. Fascinating program. And I always love when we feature historians like yourself who can be so engaging. So those lucky students who have you in class,
Thank you. That's
those of us who love
kind.
history are always so frustrated, aren't we all, when we hear people say, "Oh, I hated history because I had such bad teachers." You are certainly breaking that mold.
Thank you.
Deborah says, Deborah Thompson, who works here at KHS, says, "I really appreciate the idea of comparing different Confederate monuments to see how men were seen." I agree. I wrote that down too, Deborah. I want to look for anything about Longstreet that I can. Very enlightening. Love these programs. Fantastic. Yes. Well, thank you again. I want to also say a special thank you to all of the folks who joined us today who are members of the Kentucky Historical Society. We could not do interesting, thought-provoking programs like this without your support. So up on screen right now, I just have, if you are not a member and you would like to continue to support us, please think about joining as a KHS member. You get into programs like this for free when you're a member, making a donation or even sponsoring program. So thank you once again, and Dr. Moore, and I sure hope that we get to work together again in the future.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and don't forget, come back and join us next month when our topic will be Appalachian history, something much lighter than we discussed today. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful weekend. Deborah plays in a band with next month's speaker, Elizabeth DeSantos, so that's great. Honestly, I really wish that all students could have a professor like you, Dr. Moore. That was
Thank you.
Such an engaging lecture. You really, how long have you been teaching?